Okay, we're still in section 2 and we've completed talking about concepts and terminology of competitive bargaining. And now we're going to deal with strategies and tactics, a subject matter which is pretty straightforward really. In terms of the distinction between strategies and tactics, I think it's not always clear. But generally the idea is strategies is what you want to achieve, and tactics is how you go about getting there. We saw in the last video that the strategy was pretty straightforward, basically trying to convince the other side that your resistance point is near their resistance point, so you have a settlement close to their resistance point, and you do it by influencing them. And it's kind of, so that's, to a certain extent, I think we understand that pretty well, and if you don't have a ZAPA, then basically you're trying to influence them to move their resistance point so that you get as much value that you can out of the bargaining process. So I think really what we want to look at are the tactics, how you implement these strategies, and they fall into sort of two camps, one having to do with screening and finding out about resistance points, and the other having to do with influencing and not being influenced on your resistance point and their resistance point. So it's screening, hide your own resistance point, probing, try to discover what the other side's is. Obviously, if one side learns what the other side's resistance point is, blockaway point is, that's where the deal will be set and where it'll end up being. In influencing, if we can, the same idea, you want to influence the other party's settlement point towards her resistance point, and you want to avoid being influenced yourself. And I think probably avoiding influence is something I want to dwell on a little bit, and also this concept of influencing and understanding what influence is as opposed to perhaps information that influences as well. So why don't we go forward here a little bit. Screening, some of the tactics, silence is golden. People don't recognize maybe sometimes that when somebody you're negotiating with, particularly in multi-party circumstances where you can get away with it a little easier, where they're not participating, it's really part of a screening tactic. They recognize that if they don't open their mouths, they won't give themselves away, and if you don't have anything that you can work on, basically you're at a disadvantage if you've been disclosing all of your interests, all the factors that go into your resistance point and are really can be used as leverage against you. The other two items, calculated incompetence and overproduction of information, we see that it's generally a little harder to do. Decision makers being absent, that's something that we see quite often, don't we? And when you think about it, when the decision maker is absent, to a certain extent they've screened, the representative may not have all the information. In fact, their representative may be misled as to what the resistance point is, and the representative may be told the resistance point is this, when in fact it's really their expectation point. But in any event, so there's definitely screening by having a decision maker not there. We're going to talk more about that in the hardball section. We'll talk about hardball tactics because it's part of that as well. Timing of screening, that's something that, another point that sometimes escapes people who are involved in this process. What you'll find is that people who are well versed in competitive bargaining don't say anything at the start, and then in the end they come in and they start participating, and what they've done is they've basically sized up the situation, got information, and now they're at a point where maybe they're starting to participate by asking questions, but mostly they're in there to try and influence you. So they're coming in with the tactic of trying to influence you. So they've got through the screening, and now they're into influencing, having achieved that. So we'll sort of see how it works. One follows the other. Probing the other party's resistance point, finding out where they are. We didn't talk much about this before, but it's something that you should do in your preparation as you get into this. It's part of determining where their resistance point is, and that's something that you should be doing. Obviously you're going to get information from your client, you're going to put yourself in their shoes, you're going to walk through some scenarios, you may hire investigators. There's a lot of preparatory work that you can do in terms of trying to figure out where their resistance point is, and it's something that you should do. But once you get involved, and once you're at the table, there's a number of things you can do to get information out if you can. You can ask questions. It's one of the great ways of trying to find out and see what responses are or not answering. You can do things to kind of generate responses. Certainly the classic one is getting up to walk away, and when you get up to walk away, or another idea is when you suggest, well, why don't we adjourn this to another date, putting it off, what you can do by careful observation is seeing how the parties react to that. At closing points, as things come down to a crunch, people start to become tense and they start to give away more information. So you observe very closely at these points, and you get an idea of how badly they want the deal, because that's what you're trying to get, the signal of how badly they want the deal. And you listen carefully for the factors, the alternatives and motives, and you're trying to read fear or risk intolerance and things like that. You're trying to take all that from the process. So you're there trying to figure out where the resistance point is, and obviously using your offering as you go forward, offers and responses, and see what's happening to a certain extent, is intended to kind of help outline where that resistance point is as you think it through and from your own strategy. Moving on to influencing, when we go, we're going to talk a little bit more about influencing, but it's how you influence others is certainly something that's part of what competitive bargaining is really all about. It's trying to convince people that their position is much worse than they think, and that yours is much better than it appears. And in doing so, you're really trying to push that resistance point. Them to conclude that their situation isn't nearly as good as it should be, and your resistance point is quite close to theirs, and therefore they should see that as being the best possible settlement. What probably comes most off this page, I guess, really though, is that it's all about perceptions, and a great quote from Wall Street where he really gets across this idea of perceptions, that money itself isn't made or lost, it's simply transferred from one perception to another. And it's a theme that I'm harping on, because that's really what competitive bargaining is about. It's about managing impressions, managing perceptions that come from that, and influencing people to make them think that situations vis-a-vis resistance points and walkaway points and good and the advantages and disadvantages of the situation are not really what they appear to be, or not what they really are. In terms of talking about influencing, and probably the most important takeaway point from this little section, and it's going to be more on the defensive side, but it comes down to the idea of being able to distinguish as just part of your habits, part of how you negotiate, and a bargain, obviously, to distinguish between information, pure influence, and a combination of the two. But generally, when people are acting out in front of you, making offers, making statements, their conduct, you should be trying to analyze it, and you should be asking yourself, now, is there good information that I should be looking at here? Because I want to know about good information. Or is this pure influence? Or is this mostly influence and some information? Anyway, you want to go through that analysis yourself, and it should just be part of the process, because what it does is you'll see, it's part of the defensive mechanism, which means that you're thinking through the whole process, you're not reacting, and you're basically will be sticking to your own strategy. And that's the number one habit, really, of defending, in terms of being a good defensive competitive bargainer, is separating influence from information, and it'll help you immeasurably. So we just look at how we do influence people. We use, really there should be clear and persuasive evidence here. Presentations can be, but clear and persuasive evidence, facts, some precedents when we're doing our litigation-based mediation, certainly solid precedents. Some future actions that you can see that they've indicated that in clearest terms a commitment to do these things. These can have a very large information base, and you should consider them. There's the concept of rejecting everything that occurs at a competitive bargaining session is absolutely wrong if that's what you're doing, because you want information, you want good information. And good information, if somebody's got a solid offer on a transaction and it's there, hey, you want to rely upon that if you want to make this deal. and you should change your resistance point. Interesting one is offers. When somebody makes an offer, what extent is it information, what extent is it influence? I think you should look at offers as containing a very large influential component. Offer bluffing is really part of what competitive bargaining is. And as you'll see, when we get into it, the concept is basically to make a series of offers, intending by the way it's done, the concessions, coming down to a point, make people think that your expectation point is your resistance point. So there's a large influence component in offers, and you should always look at them that way. And if you do look at them that way, you'll be better off. All right. But there is some information conveyed to a certain extent, and certainly how they're approached to the negotiations and what their strategies are. You certainly can pick that off from some of that. Employing influencing tactics. Well, that's what we're going to look at in the second session. Some of them are really fun. Framing is a great way to influence. We have getting people committed. We have how we use reciprocity, how we use justification, vividness, how we deal with irrational biases. There's a lot of things you can do, which if you're following what's going on can help you influence an outcome, and totally legitimate. On the illegitimate side, we've got some hardball tactics. A good example, and I guess once again in the offering side of things, when somebody makes an outrageous offer, what we call a lowball or the real hardball offer, to a certain extent that's really pure influence. So if you're looking at it, you're saying that's pure influence, and it's completely beyond my resistance point. It's got absolutely no basis, and what this person is trying to do is to influence me, probably through a process of upsetting. We'll go through it, upsetting your decision-making processes, getting you anxious, but also by trying to convince you that your game is that you're not going to achieve your ends. Pure influence. And we talk about misrepresentations. They're harder, aren't they? Because that's the problem with lying, is that if it's a good lie, if you're made of, you can carry that on for 40 years. You can do very, very well before you find out that you were duped. But still, you should always be looking at what people say to you and how solid it is, and we're going to look at that in hardball tactics, how we deal with lying, generally misrepresentations. Puffing, hey, this is the best possible deal. You've heard me say that. It's a good tactic actually to influence and to get people to accept something, and if you use it properly. Pure 100% influence. All right. Non-responsive answers. When you ask a question, somebody doesn't answer it, and the answer that they give you. It's pure influence, so just disregard it. Now there is some information there, isn't there, because they didn't answer your question, and so to a certain extent you've got very valuable information, but the actual, you have to go through this analysis that that's influence, disregard, didn't answer my question, hey, that's information. So that's the habit that I'm trying to get you into. And there's a bunch of other ways we do it. Deadline pressure, it's called a scarcity tactic. It's when things are disappearing, and also, so it's intended to influence you very much in scheduling. So you see most of timing issues, conditions, scheduling, basically intended to influence you, either by putting pressure on your decision-making process or making you think something's going to disappear so that you want it more. And obviously dealing with costs. How we deal with costs can have an impact. You can manipulate it. It's pretty hardballish. But certainly the concept of the loss of not getting out of the bargaining process itself will generate influence, because people see that disappearing. It's a lost opportunity. We want to get it done. And it's when you see that thing disappearing that people start to give away where they are, and it's also a great probing tactic as well. But you can do different things to basically manipulate the situation and influence. But here you're adding a little bit to the costs, you're adding to the value, you're affecting the value. So it's not just pure influence, it's steps which are actually intended to affect worth that you should be trying to achieve with the deal. So let's finish off the section about not being influenced. And I think this is really important for this course, because given that I'm aiming at largely people who haven't done competitive bargaining, this is the defensive side of it, and these steps generally can put you in a pretty good position without a lot more. Obviously being prepared, everybody says be prepared, but it's so true. If you know what's going on, you've got such a base to go with. You mustn't react, you've got to respond. That's basically how we do things. So that if you feel yourself getting anxious, or you see your client getting anxious, and you've got to walk them through these things, hey, don't show any emotions. I've just been through, you have to separate influence from information. It just should be part of what you do in your negotiation. You're negotiating, bargaining as you listen to the other side, smiling inwardly sometimes. You got to recognize the bluff component of offers, very much that. We just talked about that. Ask lots of questions. Research shows best negotiators and bargainers ask lots of questions. Because sometimes, we pointed out, it's not just the answers you get, it's the non-answers which turn things away, because some people really don't want to lie. And when you ask them a question and they don't answer it, to a certain extent, it says things. And then you have to identify the tactics. I'm giving the labels here, hopefully, some of the hardball tactics, what it is. And you should be able to say, yeah, I see what they're up to. And from there, you want to respond strategically. You have to have your own strategy of what you want to do, and you want to do it in a civil fashion, and you want to be pushing back. All right? And through it all, you have to convey an optimistic and confident attitude and commitment to your goals. It's that kind of thing that wears them down. It's a process of, it's a mind game very much when you're trying to wear them down, and you're trying to use all of your expertise and your knowledge of what's going on to work that way. So that kind of strategy and tactics, takeaway points. Hey, it's about gamesmanship. People, when you say that, they say gamesmanship and deception. No, it can't be, but it is. Because the whole idea is hiding resistance points and making them think what they are, what they are, what they're not, what they are, whatever I'm trying to get across here. Screening, yeah, I think people don't understand the importance of screening sometimes, and these people don't seem to be participating, but no, it's part of a plan, and when they come in influencing. And basically you really got to concentrate on what influencing means and what they're trying to do. You, of course, go through the whole process here, you should have all the tactics yourself on how to influence others, and you'll have a better idea of what's going on and some of the more subtle tactics that are used. So I think that's probably it, and so we're done that, and from here we're going to go to the bargaining table, and we're going to walk through the bargaining process from beginning to end.